Thank you for joining us today at Wildly Undivided. If you enjoy these studies, hit the thumbs up and subscribe. We're going to be in 1 John, chapter 1. So it's going to be a minute before we read anything. It'll be towards the end of the study. Does anyone want to take a stab at any introductory information for the book of 1 John? Take some swings. What do we want to know if we're talking about the introduction? It's a letter. So what? Okay, what else? Okay, it's the first of 3 letters. Who's it going to? Yep, the author, the Apostle John. It's the gospel according to, and then we call it John. This is just a letter that's written by. So they're both written by John, but one is a gospel, a commentary on the life of Jesus, or a biography on the life of Jesus, and this is just a declaration of faith, a declaration of truth. So that's what would make them distinctive. The writing style is very similar. So when we get into a book in the Bible, we have to ask certain questions. It doesn't matter what book of the Bible, we have to ask them. You have to understand the context and the situation surrounding the book. Who wrote it? Why did they write it? Right? So it's author, what, where, when, why, and who. You can elaborate and extend that, but generally, if you can grasp those basic foundational principles, when you get into reading it, it makes a whole lot more sense. So at the end of tonight, my hope is that after we discuss this, we read the first verse in the book, and it kind of clicks a little better for us, and it makes more sense why he's speaking the way that he's speaking in the context of its history. So the author is the Apostle John. There have been people like, anybody know what higher criticism is? Higher criticism was a movement in the late 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. It's kind of through that whole era where people started challenging the fundamental beliefs that the traditions held for the Bible. It wasn't so much traditions, it was facts, but they weren't proven. They weren't tested. So people started criticizing or trying to validate and speculate about the Bible. Every inch, every word, every idea, they really started to get critical on the contents of the Bible, particularly who wrote stuff, when was it written. All the facts that we kind of have now were generated through higher criticism. Now, the great thing about the Word of God is it's an anvil. You can swing on it all day long, but you're going to break your hammer before you break the anvil. And so what we have received from all of the fallout of higher criticism is really good foundational facts. We have an assurity of the things that we know. So the book of 1 John is written by the Apostle John. There are people who have speculations that it could be written by somebody else, but it's not a very strong evidence. What is more strong is that the Gospel of John, the book of 1 John, has very similar language, a very similar concept, way of talking about Jesus. And so it's small things like John doesn't actually name himself in the letter, and he doesn't name himself in the Gospel of John. So that's in his character. And he says things like we instead of I. He incorporates himself. He kind of loses himself in the sense of we are all part of this, not just me as an individual. And so there's not a lot of criticism towards the authorship. It is pretty clear that John wrote it. So John was, anybody know his job or his career? James and John were tending their nets with their father, and Jesus says, come and follow me. And they left their nets with the servants and left. And they followed Jesus. So they are fishermen. They are the sons of Zebedee and Salome. Now, he is also the brother of James, the other apostle James. So James and John and Peter are the 3 most inner circled individuals with Jesus. They are the 3 that went up on the hill of transfiguration and really experienced something that nobody else saw. And Jesus told them, don't tell anybody until I'm resurrected. Out of the 127, there was the 12, and out of the 12, there were the 3. And John is in the inner circle of those 3 with his brother James. Now, Salome Salome is presumed, we don't have a particular fact on this, but it seems as if Salome is related to Mary, the mother of Jesus, that she is the sister to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so John could be a cousin to Jesus. But where we get that from is it says that Salome is the sister of Mary. But there's a couple Marys. So there's a little bit of conjecture, a little bit of tradition involved with that. We're not 100% certain. What's interesting is that when James and John left their father, they were tending the boat and they left him in the hands of the servants. And so most fishermen would have their own boat or work on a boat, but they didn't really own servants or have, a business that's thriving to that level. And so they have servants. And Salome, the mother of John, supported Jesus' ministry with financial aid. And so she was some of the women who went around and tended to the needs of the disciples. And so it seems that John was actually well off. His family is a family of influence. They had notoriety in their business, but also his mother came to Jesus and said, hey, I have a favor to ask. Let my two boys sit on your right hand and on your left. That was a very prestigious thing to do. You had to have some swag. You know what I mean? Like you don't walk up to a very important person and just say, hey, can I ask you a favor? So it would seem that the air around this family is that they're pretty well-to-do, they're pretty well off, and James and John are the sons of thunder, that they are so zealous that they are loud and boisterous and rambunctious. There was a time in Luke chapter 9, verse 54, when Jesus wanted to enter Samaria and the Samaritans rejected him. And John comes over and is like, hey, can we call down fire on these people? Remembering that Elijah had done that when Elisha had sent people to capture him. And so this man of God, who was very spiritual, called down fire. He says, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down and consume you. And so soldier after soldier after soldier just gets burned up by fire from heaven, which is pretty spectacular. So John and James felt so indignant. They felt so strong about it. And, being righteous, holy men, they thought, hey, Jesus, if you allow us, we could call down some fire. We could treat these people with some judgment. How do you feel about that? So Jesus had some strict words for him. But that's the temperament of these two young men. That's the lifestyle that they grew up with, their dad, their mom, the family, and the political kind of swag. And so when we get into John, what we need to realize is that this is probably another 60 years later. This is 50, 60 years after Jesus. John's an old man, and he used to be that fiery youth, and now he is this old man writing a letter to the church. And so he is a very different person. He's learned a lot. The Spirit of God has really worked on him. And you hear him talk about love and brotherly affection and light and darkness and all of these concepts. And at the time, he probably didn't grasp it. So that is the author. That's a good point about John. He's very loyal. And so he followed Jesus to the cross. He was there. He was the only disciple that really made it through that trial of testing. Peter fell off. All the other disciples ran away. And that's another sign of his swag, that their family had pulled, because he could make his way into the high priest's temple. He was accepted generally by the Pharisees, where Peter was, outside, and they're like, hey, you're a Galilean. So John was like, hey, I'm gonna waltz on in here. And he actually went outside and he got Peter and brought him in. Not only is he loyal, but has some political swag. And then that scene that you're talking about, Jesus being on the cross, looks down and sees his mom and says, Mother, behold your son. And he looks over at John and he says, John, behold your mother. And so the concept is, and then it says Mary never went home that day. She went and lived with John. And so it's as if John adopted her and protected her and took care of her. And so he had provisions to do that as well, right? So it's interesting. We like to think of the holiest of holy people tend to be poor, but John's pretty well off generally in the beginning of the story. Now, towards the end of the story, what does he look like? We're not certain. It doesn't say. So that's a good point. I left some information out. When I do these, I try not to make them too thorough, because it's literally, you can sit down and read a book and it'll just tell you all the same information, because that's what I do. I just read a book, right? So there is a lot of ancient manuscripts in the early era of the church, right? So the very early stages of the church, John's disciple had a disciple who wrote about John and he quotes John, the book of John, the first book of John. And so there is probably a handful of ancient authors who quote this book and attest to him being the author. So there's a lot of early church manuscripts that say that John wrote this. So what is it? It's an open letter to the general church. It actually doesn't tell us who it's to. He just says, hey, I'm writing to you for this reason. I'm writing to the little children. I'm writing to the young men. I'm writing to the fathers. It's a very vague conversation that he's having, and we'll get into the reasons for that. So it's an open letter. So an epistle is the technical term that we would use for this type of writing, which is a letter. Where is it written? It's written in Asia Minor. Anybody know where Asia Minor is? It's modern day Turkey, and it's just above the Middle East, right? So you have Israel and you have Russia over here. It's just to the side of Russia above Israel in the Middle East. So if you move left, you would get into Europe. And if you move left and up, you get into India. Modern day Turkey is a focal point for Christianity. You have a lot of churches rooted in the early foundations of the church, and we'll get into those particular churches. But Ephesus is the location where John would be. So everybody says that John became a long-term pastor and elder in that area and in that city. And so he would have left Jerusalem, gone all the way up to Ephesus. Ephesus, that church was founded by the Apostle Paul on his missionary journeys, and he left them with a warning. And he said, when I leave, lots of wolves will come in to destroy the flock. And even from within, there will be those of you who will rise up to pull disciples away after themselves. And so the Apostle Paul gave a warning that false teachers will come into the church, and they did. And so the Apostle John is in Ephesus, and he is ministering in that city. He is going to write this letter to generally publish to the world, but really the churches in that area, because they are being plagued by false teachers. And so it was written around 90 to 95 AD. Because John doesn't reference persecution, like a high-level persecution, around the year 100, there was a very heavy persecution that came upon the church. And so for John not to reference it, people believe that it hadn't been written yet. But the way that he talks in the situations that he's in puts him at his later years of life. He refers to him as an elder and talking to everybody like they're children, not in a negative or derogatory sense, but simply saying children or young men or fathers. He really is kind of at that older age of life, looking back and trying to bring up those who are younger than him. And so it's believed to be that John would be about 80 and written around 80, 90 to 95. Now, why is it written? I touched on this a little bit. To confront false teaching in the church. That people have crept in from outside, and people have on the inside gone off and wandered into false teaching. And so he is confronting the truths and the doctrines that are most important, foundational to the scriptures. And we'll talk about some of those details as we get to the next sections. That's how it starts. So 1, it's to confront false teachers and false teachings. And 2, to establish and assure the saints. It's to take those who are doing what's good, what's right, what's true, and give them the assurance that they do have eternal life, that they will receive the goodness of God, that they will walk with him, that they will receive his joy, that they would fellowship with him. And so he is not only fighting against falsehood, but he is establishing the blessings that the saints get to have. And so when you get to just the intro here, 1 John chapter 1, verse 4, he says, I'm writing these things so that we would have joy as a child of God. And then he's going to talk about what it means to be a child of God. These studies are recorded live with God's people. We encourage you to find a study in a Bible-believing and teaching church and connect with God's people in God's Word. Have a blessed day. Now, this is the big background that's probably the most important. Who is it written to? What culture is this? What he talks about is false teachings. And so what we have is the Roman era. The Roman era, what they did is they brought in the peace of Rome. Pax Romanus, I think it's called. So the peace of Rome was this idea that we will leave you alone as long as you don't do things we disagree with. So you can worship whatever God you want. You can perform any rituals you want, but you're going to pay your taxes. And you're not going to be a problem in society. If you become a problem, we will get rid of you, because our guarantee to the nations that we run is that we will keep peace. We will have peace in the nations, which, to be fair, is quite nice. So in that era, everything was acceptable. There was no such thing as, like homosexuality wasn't a problem. Like, they were really free to do almost anything and accept anything. And so all religions were considered good except for the exclusive ones. The ones that said, this is the truth and everything else is a lie, that would be rejected, which is Christianity. So Jesus shows up on the scene and he says, look, I'm the way, I'm the truth, and I am the life. Like, there is zero chance you get to the Father except through me. And so in the Roman culture, that's not acceptable because they accept all gods. And not only can you accept all gods, you can pick and choose philosophies and ideas and principles that you like. And so you have the Greek philosophies, particularly Plato. You have the Jewish foundation of the Old Testament and the law. And you have this new kind of Christian revelation that's taking place where Jesus is the Savior of the world. And you take all those philosophies, you mix them all up, and you pour the dice out, and you decide what you want to take from it. And so that religion turned into Gnosticism. So the era is Rome, inclusive. They were taking all new ideas and adding to old ideas and bringing them together. So you have the Gnostics, and then you have emperor worship. Have you ever hear of Caesar is Lord? Have you ever heard of that? So the Christians had to say Caesar is Lord, and all they had to do was just offer a little bit of incense or be killed. That was kind of the era that was starting to come up. It hadn't really happened yet. And so worshiping the emperor as another god among many was acceptable, right? Just, you can worship your God, but you also have to say that Caesar is Lord. It is the worship of the emperor. And if you don't do that, there's consequences. So that's the era. And in Asia Minor, they're right in the bridge of the Middle East to Europe. And so you had a lot of immigration, and you also had a lot of warring. There was we'd call it modern day Russians. I don't know what they call them in the past. But they would come down and they would kind of war a little bit, and then the Middle East would come up and they would war, and then the Europeans would come over and they'd war. And that's where Rome came from, right? They came from the European side, and they came and they swept down all the way down into Africa, right? It's pretty amazing. With all of that conglomeration happening in that era, you have a lot of influence of culture and a lot of change. It is really a melting pot. And so ideas are being changed and transformed. And what we end up with is these 7 churches that are mentioned in Revelation in this area. And so in the book of Revelation, so all of these churches are in Asia Minor, what we would call Turkey, right? We're not talking about Jerusalem. We're not talking about what we would think is the Holy Lands, which is kind of interesting because when you get into the book of Revelation, like, why are we talking about the people? Like, God's temple is going to come down on Jerusalem. God's going to judge. God's going to do all this stuff. There's a new heaven and new earth, all these amazing things. Why are we focusing way over here and talking about these people? I would say it's conjecture. There's nothing that I know for sure. The church blew up in this area. The church always does really well with difficulty. And so with all the invasions, with all the conquering, with all the immigration, with all the violence, with all the things that could be happening in those societies, the gospel is so powerful. And so people, I'd imagine, would be coming to the Lord pretty drastically. And I think this really became the center of the Christian church for a time. And so when Jesus addresses them in Revelation, he addresses each church and he says lots of negative things about them, that false teachers have come in, that they've wandered from their previous love. And he actually says every church has problems except for 2 churches. It would be Smyrna and Philadelphia. So out of all the churches displayed here, 2 of them aren't necessarily rebuked. So there's a lot of problems in the church. What would be the problems? And I kind of alluded to this earlier. So you have the Greek, Jewish, and Christian influence mashing together, people picking and choosing whatever they want to believe in. And then you get Gnosticism. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. It's to have knowledge. And so there's an elite group of people who believe that they're smarter than everybody else. They believe that they have secret knowledge that nobody else has. And if you had this knowledge, then you would be more holy, right? So what they believed in, some fundamental beliefs, is that all matter is inherently evil. What is matter? Anything that's physical, exactly. It could be that chair, it could be your flesh. Everything that is physical is evil. And the spirit on the inside, the immaterial, is the only thing that is good. So that is just the fundamental principle. That is the knowledge that they had. They said, you know what? Your body is sinful. There's some consequences to this. What do you think? Like, if all things physical are evil and only the spirit is good, what does that do to the character of Jesus? How would that change our theology? So Jesus' body was evil. If all things material are evil, then Jesus' body was evil. So that poses a problem, because I believe Jesus is God. These people actually believed in the deity of Jesus, didn't have a struggle with that, because they understand the Spirit is good, the Spirit is holy. They can grasp that. How do you reconcile that? You have to create a theology to manage that problem that says that the body is evil. How do we fix that with this false teaching? Did Jesus have a body? Well, he did. Biblically, Jesus had a body. But if I believe the body is evil, he was spirit only. Jesus didn't have a body. What does that do to the cross? Then he didn't die. So you can see the trouble that this could spread through the church. Now, these are very persuasive people. And think about philosophy. Philosophy is all about rational, perceptive thinking, right? It is all about questioning and logic and going in circles and over and over and over again. It's not all that difficult to fool people. And so they generate a philosophy and they explain away and they say Jesus was only a spirit. And he appeared to be a man, like an angel, right? He just appeared to be like a man, but he wasn't actually a man. So they deny the incarnation. What's the other one? Jesus did have a body, but he was just a normal man that the Spirit came upon when he was baptized. And then before he died, the Spirit left him. You see how this theology becomes one principal foundational thought. All material items are evil. Only the Spirit is good. And we have drastically changed the character of Jesus. John is fighting against this, okay? So Jesus was not incarnate. He had no real body, only the appearance of a body. John, in his gospel, says what? The Word became flesh. I don't think you can get any more clear than that. He will when we get into the end of this, but then the next one, Christ, the Spirit, descended on the man Jesus at baptism, but left him before the crucifixion. And John says that he was baptized and crucified, that the Christ was baptized and crucified. He's very clear to put those together, particularly in 1 John. Then there's another one. If my body is only evil, what does that mean when I do evil things? Because if my spirit is good, but my body is evil, and I do evil things, does it hurt my spirit? So the spirit would still remain good. So it doesn't matter what I do. I can do anything I want because the body is evil. All fleshly things are evil, but my spirit is good. So now let me go with these prostitutes. Let me do these drugs, stealing, killing. My spirit's good. So that was a big problem. They were indifferent to moral values and behavior. Sin committed in the body did not affect the spirit. No sin, we deceive ourselves, is what John says. If we say that we don't have sin, we deceive ourselves. If we continue in sin, we don't have the truth, is what he says. We don't walk in the light. We'll look at this where John is just hammering it over and over and over again. You cannot say you are united with God and act so sinfully. He is going to hit that so hard. He says, look, if you sin, you have somebody to bring forgiveness. That's Jesus the righteous. But if you say you don't have sin because your body is just going to do its own thing, and so you're pure, you're a liar and you don't walk in the truth. The next one is it created a self-righteousness for those who have been enlightened. There's us who are enlightened, and there's them who are the fools. And so it really started to divide the church. People started to mistreat each other. And so they scorned all the believers who didn't do what they did or believed in the way that they did. So the Gnostics actually became their own little sect, and they pointed the finger at everybody else and said, well, you guys are all wrong. And I think we've seen that even in our day and age with other issues. But the problem is they weren't walking in love. And so John's going to touch on this over and over again as well. If you love God, you have to love his children. You cannot say you love God and hate your brother. And he's going to really drive that home. So a lot of this context of what he's talking about is surrounding false teachings. He's correcting, he's corralling all of the frayed hairs, and he's bringing them in, tying them up, and straightening them out so that people can get these concepts straight. Let's get into 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. We're just going to touch a little bit on what he says, and then we'll talk about it again next week, maybe in more detail. Yeah, probably more detail. So he says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. What is he talking about there? Why would he start the intro to his letter like that? What does he say? Give me some particular words. That's a good one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What was his experience with Jesus like? Face to face. He says, I heard him. Okay. There's hearing, there's the lessons and the parables and all those things. But then he says, I have seen with my eyes. I beheld his glory. I watched his kindness, his miracles, his resurrection power with his words, telling Lazarus to come up out of the grave, raising that little 12-year-old girl. I have seen the power of God. But then he gets even deeper and he says, looked upon and have touched with our hands. I felt his body. I handled him. I leaned upon him. Why is it so important that his eyewitness testimony has these characteristics? He's confronting falsehood. And he's saying this, I was a witness. I walked with him. I talked with him. I put my arm around him. He hugged me. He carried me. He picked me up. He split the loaves in his hand and he handed them to me. And when he handed the loaves and he put them in my hand, his hand touched my hand. He heard completely. He had seen physically. He had beheld intimately and touched and grasped the Lord Jesus physically. That is the introduction to John. We get a little bit of flavor on his apologetics. Apologetics, what it means is defense. We see his defending of the truth. What we're going to find is that he is very black and white. When I was a young Christian, I loved this because I was very black and white. I think nowadays we kind of walk in the gray. John didn't walk in the gray, 80 years old. And he's like, nah, man, you either follow the truth or you're following a lie. You're in the light or you're in the dark. You're either in or you're out. You left, then you're out, right? He'll tell you. It's like that old grumpy man. He'll tell you. Ain't no holding back. Okay, so what are some applications we can take away from tonight's lesson? Recognizing the issues, recognizing poor theology. We have to know where people are going astray to correct it, right? And so the Apostle John is out there fighting, but to fight properly, for him to sit down and say, you know what, I heard, I saw, I beheld, I handled. He has to know that that's what people are struggling with, right? So there's a lot of attention that needs to be given to fight for the truth. You have to know what is error. Not that you need to study the error, but know it when you hear it so that you can respond in a meaningful manner. And that's what this letter is. It's a response to error. And then his ultimate goal is to encourage and build up those who are either led astray or just to build up the saints. His goal is to build up. He's not trying to destroy. He's not trying to separate, to tear down, to tear apart, and to push people down. He's simply stating, if you are going to be right with God, this is the way. If you are going to do what is good, true, and pleasing in his sight, this is what you must do. This is for your benefit. I'm not here to hurt. I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to establish, to encourage, and to build up. And so some of this that he says is pretty hard, right? He's going to talk about Antichrist, the spirit of the age. He's like, there are many antichrists. I'm like, wait, are you calling me the antichrist? It's like, well, if you don't have the Spirit of Jesus, he doesn't mean it in a way that's meant to tear down. It's meant to build up, right? That's the intention. And then to know the word, you must know the background. I did not, for a very long time, I did not understand 1 John. There's a lot of repetition that he goes through, and he says the same stuff over and over again with different nuances. We'll talk about it when we get there. But when you recognize the battles that he's having, it's like watching Bruce Lee fighting. And when you're not a martial artist, you're just like, oh, like he did some cool stuff. He's got nunchucks, he's super fast. But when you know that if you slow down and you pause and you see his hands and he's blocking and he's guarding and he's grabbing, he's twisting, he's pushing, he's setting him off balance and then throwing him on the ground, there is a process, there's a procedure. And learning the background and learning the concept of what's going on in the world at the time, it's very much watching a master fighting and perceiving clearly how he's just cutting down his foes and just telling them that every little thing is wrong here and wrong here and wrong here, and that this is the truth and this is the truth and this is the truth. It's a masterclass in correction.